How do we move? The skeleton has many joints. A joint, also called an articulation, in any place where adjacent bones or bone and cartilage come together. The human body is a fascinating piece of biological machinery in the skeletal system, a crucial role in it. Joints, or what we call articulations, are the points where two or more bones have met. They are responsible for our movement and to provide our mechanical support. Just for example, in the knee. In the knee, joints allows for the bending and also the straightening. There are two classifications of joints. Number one is the structural classification. Structural classifications of joints take into account whether the adjacent bones are strongly anchored to each other by fibrous connective tissue or cartilage, or where the adjacent bones articulate with each other within a fluid-filled space called a joint activity. So, here's my explanation. The structural classification of joints is based on the type of our connective tissue that binds the bones together and whether a joint activity is also present. So, there are three types of structural classifications. Number one is the fibrous, number two is the cartilaginous, and synovial joints. Fibrous joints are connected by tissue. The bones are closely together by fibrous tissues, and there is no type of joints is the sutures and the skull. The cartilaginous joints, the bones are joined by the cartilage. Like fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints also lack a joint activity. An example would be the joints between the vertebrae in the spine, which are connected by cartilage. Synovial joints. These joints have a fluid filled joint cavity that separates out the articulating surfaces of the bones. The surfaces of these bones are covered with articular cartilage and they are enclosed within a capsule of connective tissue. Most of the joints in the body are synovial, like the knee or elbow. Each type of three joints allow for different types of movement and has different levels of mobility and stability. Functional classifications describe the degree of movement available between the bones, ranging from immobile to slightly mobile. To freely joint of the body is related movable joints. The amount of movement available a particular joint of the body related to the functional requirements for that joints. Thus, immobile or slightly immobile joints serve to protect internal organs, give stability to the body, and allow for limited body movement. In contrast, freely movable joints allow for much more extensive movable movements of the body and the limbs. The functional classifications of our joints is based on the amount of movement that they allow. There are three categories in this classification. Number one is the synarthrosis, number two is the ampiarthrosis, and number three is the diarthrosis. The synarthrosis, these are what we call immovable joints, and they are also designed to provide stability. They are often found where protection is needed, such as in the skull to protect our brain. The bones is, in these joints are held together by fibrous tissue and there is no joint cavity in here. The number two is the ampiarthrosis. These joints are what we call slightly movable joints, providing a balance between stability and mobility. They are often found in areas where strength and flexibility are needed. Like the vertebrae in our spine, the bones in these joints are usually connected by our cartilage. Diarthrosis. These are freely movable joints that provide a wide range of our motion. They are the most common type of joint in the body and include joints like elbow, knee, shoulder. These joints have a cavity filled with synovial fluid which help reduce friction and so allow for smooth movements. So the functional classification joints is all about the balance between mobility and stability depending on the needs of the body. Immovable joints, a information of two bones that have been fused together. Such joints are capable of movement by muscular force. Immovable, immovable joints, also known as synarthrosis in the functional classification of joints, are joints that don't move. The bones in these joints are held together by the fibrous tissue and there's no joint cavity. So the term immovable can be a bit misleading. True, while the disjoints doesn't allow for this kind of movement, we typically think of when we think about joints, like bending your elbow or rotating your waist. They can still respond to forces and pressures. They can slightly give or move under certain conditions, but this movement is a minimal and not under voluntary control. A good example of this type of joints is two sutures in the skull. The bones of the skull are fused together by fibrous tissue. It is also creating a joint that doesn't allow movement. This is a crucial for protecting our brain. Meanwhile, these joints are described as immovable. It is important to understand that they can still respond to forces and pressures even if they don't allow for voluntary movement. Slightly movable joints. These joints are not firmly fixed as are immovable joints, but the structure of the bones and connective tissues and around the joints restricts the range of motion to only a few degrees. So here's the explanation. Slight, slightly movable joints, or also known as amphiarthrosis, allow a small amount of movement, but not as much as freely movable joints. The bones in these joints are usually connected by our cartilage, or what we call fibrous connective tissue, which restrict the range of motion. A good example of slightly movable joints are the joints between the vertebrae and our spine. These joints are connected by intervertebral disc of cartilage, which allow for a small amount of our movement. This limited movement, when combined across all the vertebrae in the spine, allows for a significant range of our motion, including bending forward, backward, and side to side. So, while slightly movable joints don't allow for a wide range of our motion, they stay they still play a crucial role in our body by providing both stability and flexibility. Free movable joints. These joints have a comparatively large of movement and are the prime importance in motor performances. They are located in the upper and the lower extremities. Free movable joints are also known as diarthrosis, are the most common type of joint in our body. They are allow for a wide range of movement unlike the two others na next na nabanggit kanina. They allow for a wide range of movement, making them crucial for many of our daily activities. These joints are characterized by the presence of a joint cavity filled with synovial fluid, which helps re- reduce frictions and allow for smooth movement. The ends of the bones in these joints are covered with a layer of our cartilage, which also reduce frictions and absorb shock. Joints. Joints can be acquired as a result of impact, internal forces, or a mixture of both. Joints, in the context you mentioned, refer to the connections between two or more components or parts of our structure. They can be formed as a result of the external forces, internal forces, or a combination of both. So let's discuss the external forces. External forces, such as the impact or loads, can cause joints to form. For example, when two objects collide, the impact can create a joint where two objects are connected. Similarly, when a load is applied to a structure, it can cause the components to come together and form joints. Internal forces within a structure can also lead to the formation of our joints. These forces can cause by factors such as stress, strain, or deformation. When the internal forces exceed the strength or tolerance of the material, joints can form as a way to redistribute or absorb the forces. In some cases, joints may be formed as a combination of external and external forces. A structure may experience both external loads and internal stresses, leading to the formation of joints at specific points where the forces are concentrated. Sports. The demand of sports places severe stress on our joints. First, we must warm up truly before activity and we should cool down afterwards. Engaging in sports and physical activities that we do, we must play a significant stress on our joints. It is important to take a certain precautions to protect our joints and minimize the risk of injury. So, one crucial step is to warm up surely before participating in any sports or physical activity that we must do. A proper warm up helps increase blood for the flow in the muscles and joints improves flexibility and prepare the body for the demands of exercise. It typically involves light aerobic exercises, dynamic stretching, and specific movements that the motions of the sport or activity you'll be engaging in. By warming up, you can reduce the risk of joint injuries, such as sprains or strains. Important is cooling down after physical activity. Cooling down allows your body to gradually return to its resting state and helps prevent muscles soreness and stiffness. It typically involves gentle exercise such as walking, stretching to gradually decrease your heart rate and promote recovery. Cooling down also help preventing blood pooling in the extremities and aid in the removal of metabolic waste products from the muscles. Planes of the body. Sagittal plane is a vertical plane extending in an antero-posterior direction, dividing the body into right and left parts. Effectively, the forward and backward plane. A sagittal plane is any plane parallel to the median plane. So here's the explanation. The sagittal plane is a vertical plane that tends in an antero-posterior or what we call front-back direction, dividing the body into right and left parts. It effectively creates a forward and backward plane. The sagittal plane runs parallel to the median plane, which is a specific sagittal plane that divides the body into equal right and left halves. In simple terms, if you were to imagine a line running down the middle of your body from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet, that line will be the median plane. Any other vertical plane that runs parallel to this line, dividing into the body into right and left parts, is considered as a sagittal plane. The sagittal plane is important in understanding movements and positions of body parts because movements that occur within the sagittal plane include flexion or what we call also a bending forward and extension or also what we call straightening backward of body parts. For example, when you bend your elbow of the knee, those movements occur within the sagittal plane. Coronal plane is a vertical plane at right angles to the sagittal plane that divides the body into interior or front and posterior or back portions, effectively the side movements plane. The coronal plane, or also what we call frontal plane, is another important plane of our body. It is a vertical plane that is perpendicular or at the right angles to the sagittal plane. The coronal plane divides the body into interior or front and posterior or back portions. Effectively, it is a creating a side-to-side movement plane. If we are going to imagine a line running from one side of our body to the other, dividing it into the front and back halves, that line will be what we call coronal plane. This plane is also oriented at a right angle to the sagittal plane, which divides the body into right and left halves. And this movement, it is occurs within the coronal plane involves side to side or lateral movements. For example, when you perform jump exercise, your arms and legs move out to the sides, which occurs within the coronal plane. Other movement with this plane include abduction or moving a body part away from the midline of the body, and adduction or also what we call moving a body part toward in the midline. So it is important to understand the coronal plane because it is explains the anatomical and physiological discussions that will help us to describe the orientation and the movement of our body parts. It is the one of the three main planes along with the sagittal plane and the transverse or horizontal plane that they are commonly used to describe our body's anatomical features and movement. Transverse plane is a horizontal cross-section dividing the body into the upper and lower sections and lies at right angles to the other two planes, effectively the rotational movement plane. So the transverse plane, or also known as the horizontal plane or axial plane, is another important plane in our body. Unlike the sagittal and coronal planes, which are vertical, the transverse plane is a horizontal cross-section that divides the body into upper and lower sections. So, if we are gonna imagine a line slicing through your body horizontally, it will divide into upper and the lower portion. So the line will present the transverse plane. This plane is oriented at right angles to the both sagittal and coronal planes. So the transverse plane is particularly important for understanding rotational movements. Movements that occur within these planes involve rotation or twisting of body parts. For example, when you rotate your head from the side to side, you are moving within the transverse plane. And the other movement within this plane include supination and pronation of the forearm, twisting of the trunk, and rotation of the hips. In addition, the rotational movement, the transverse plane helps in understanding anatomical relationships and structures within the body. It is used in medical imaging, such as CT scans or MRI, to obtain cross sectional views of the body